Hello, good people, and welcome to Hillbilly Cat History. Signed, sealed, remembered, epic Circle G. Hi, Keith. Hi, Nancy. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate seeing you guys here. And Nancy's saying that she thinks Elvis really felt good on the Circle G Ranch. That he was sleeping better, he was up during the day, he was sleeping all night, and that he may have even cut back on his medication. And she wishes he would have kept it. Well, we've got a lot more story to go, Nancy, so we're going to find out the answer to some of those things. Hi, chillin' in Canada. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. And if you were with us for the last episodes, you know that we're taking the deepest dive into Circle G that's ever been given. And we've heard from all kinds of people. And we've recently been hearing from the guy that's on the screen right now, who is Gary Pepper. Gary Pepper was a very special friend of Elvis. And I've explained who he is in the earlier episodes, so if you don't know him, I highly encourage you to watch those episodes so that you can get to know Gary. And Gary once wrote Elvis a very important telegram. Hi, Marion. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. And Gary wrote a very important telegram to Elvis at a moment when he really needed it. And it lifted his spirit. And Elvis bared his heart to Gary in a letter that he wrote back to him. And that's what this song is about, that I wrote, called Telegram from a Friend.
The lights came down on Vegas gold. July heat, a crown retold. Applause like thunder, stars align. But one true friend was not in line. A telegram, a quiet grace, from 12 years deep, a loyal face. I read your words, they calmed the flame. In all that noise I spoke your name. I wish you could have been here, Gary. The velvet night, the roaring crowd. But in my heart your voice was steady, a whisper soft, a faith unbowed. 4 more weeks this fire will fade. I'll find my way back through the haze to Graceland's porch where silence sings and friendship wears no stage or wings. The suits, the gifts, the famous hands, they cheered the king, they made demands. But in the mirror doubt would stare, and only you knew what was there. I wrote you lines in trembling ink, not for the press, not for the drink, just for the man who saw me hold beyond the glitter, past the road. Say hello to everyone, I'll be home when this is done. The curtain falls, the echo fades, but you remain my serenade. 4 more weeks this fire will fade. I'll find my way back through the hay to Graceland's porch where silence sings and friendship wears no stage or wings.
Thank you for gathering. This is Hillbilly Cat History, where we remember together and listen for the echoes. And today, we explore gifts that carry memory. But before we look at those gifts, we're going to look at a new voice. We've seen him earlier in the archive, and we've heard some things that he had to say. But now we're going to find out how he got into the archive and how it all started. Hi, Terry. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. Thank you so much, Keith. I appreciate your faith that the episode is going to be good. I hope that it is. We're going to talk today about Elvis's good friend, George Klein, because he too was connected to the Circle G. But we're going to start way back in 1951. So the Circle G was bought in February of 1967. So we're going back to the previous decade. More than 10 years, more than 15 years in the past. 1951. Elvis was in high school. George Klein was in high school. Humes High in Memphis. They're both in the same class, meaning that they're both going to graduate the same year. George is a popular kid. He purposely is a popular kid. He likes to be popular. He goes out there, he does the schmoozing, and he treats people very well. And Elvis remembers that George treated him well. And that's one of the reasons that they were friends. But there was something else that happened to George during that period. And I think that it's something that stuck with Elvis. And that Elvis remembered for the rest of his life. And that's one of the reasons that he wanted to bring George into the group. And it happened in 1951, on July 29th. And on screen now, we can see it's a gravestone, well worn. It says Morris Klein, Tennessee, private, 311 Supply, Tennessee, 86 DIV, which is division, World War I. Born May 2nd, 1895. Died July 29th, 1951. This is George's father. So when Elvis and George were sophomores in high school, George's father passed away. And George was left to care for his mother, all on his own. And I'm sure that's something that struck Elvis. Because even though this happened in July in the summer, between their sophomore and junior year, everybody in school knew George. He was very popular. So everybody would have known his father died. And Elvis would have thought about, what if Vernon had died? And he had been left alone to take care of Gladys. And here we can see the headstone for Morris Klein, beloved husband and father. And the dates are repeated. And someone had mentioned that Elvis, or that George might be Jewish. Keith had said, I believe he was Jewish too. Well, he was. And you can see I believe that's Hebrew, that's written on the tombstones. Not sure. But he was Jewish. I don't believe George was practicing. I don't know if his parents were. The headstone seems to indicate they might have been. because they're certainly honoring their Jewish heritage on the tombstone. And you can see his mother is also there, wife, mother, and grandmother. And I don't believe George had any children, so that would indicate that he has at least some brothers and sisters, maybe one or two. So he might not have been all alone having to care for his mother. Not sure. But her name was Bertha F. Klein, August 7th, 1898, when she was born. And she passed away October 3rd, 1982. So she outlived her husband, she outlived Elvis, she outlived Gladys, and she outlived Vernon. Yeah, that was George Klein's mother. But we're talking about his father, who passed away when he was in high school. And Elvis, for sure, would have known that. Now we see a car on screen, and we're going to get to this car. And some of you may already recognize it. And Nancy's saying, how old was he when he passed away? I can't see the stone. So 1795. I think he was 56. Yeah, 56 years old. So not terribly old. And the year after he passed away, so not in 52, well, in late 52, and then into 53, George became class president of the senior year. So even though George's father is gone, he has risen above that. He's dealt with that grief, or he's dealing with it, and he's gone out there and he hasn't let it stop him. He's become the class president. While he's trying to care for his mother and trying to fill the absence of his father. And then Elvis runs into George in early 1957. And George had been working as a DJ right until that day. And they had just terminated him because they said, we don't think this rock and roll thing is going to stick around. We think it's on its way out. And we're going to go ahead and axe all the rock and roll DJs. So that's what they did. And George was really the rock and roll DJ at that particular radio station. And so George, he went to see Dewey Phillips, who was broadcasting out of the magazine floor in the Chickasaw Hotel. The way that Dewey would describe it. It was the mezzanine floor, which is basically, it was the second floor of the Chickasaw Hotel. And while Dewey had a big glassed-in DJ booth, and if you've ever been to Graceland, now there's an exhibit of that booth based on the movie, the Baz Luhrmann movie. And you can see kind of what it would have looked like, or at least what Baz kind of thinks it looked like. But it's still really interesting, and it looks like the pictures that I've seen of it. But teenagers could come in and stand outside the booth and watch Dewey do his thing. But George was in the business and had worked for Dewey before, and worked for Dewey later, one or the other, I can't remember, but he was known in the business. So he would have been able to get into the booth itself. And while he was there, somebody else came visiting Dewey, and that was Elvis. And Elvis, of course, he always liked George. And I think this is why he always liked George. He knew that George was a really stand-up guy that loved his parents, and that he had suffered the loss of his father, and he was really impressed with the way that George had handled it. So when he saw George, he was always very friendly with him. And he said, hey, well, what's going on? How you doing? And George tells him, I was great until today, but I'll figure something out. Well, Elvis was getting ready to leave for a big tour. It's the Gold Suit Tour. The one where he wears the gold lame suit. I'm sure everybody knows the gold lame suit. And so Elvis had never worn that suit before. He was about to go out and start the tour where he wore it for the very first time. And he looked at George and he said, hey, George, why don't you just come with me? I'll give you a job. And George is like, well, what will I do? He says, well, you'll just accompany me and we'll have fun together. And George says, well, I'm not doing anything else. That sounds like a great idea. He goes, we're going to go travel through the countryside right now as we do this tour, and we'll end up in Canada. And eventually, we're going to end up doing the movies out in Hollywood. Elvis had already been out to Hollywood, so he already had scheduled stuff that was getting ready to happen. And George thought this sounded great. So they went. George said, hey, where do we do right now? Elvis says, well, come on, let's go get in my car and go. So they jumped in Elvis's car and they went back to his house, which would have been Audubon Drive. And of course, Audubon Drive was a one-story ranch house with a fence around it, and there was always a load of girls, band girls, that were outside that fence wanting to get in. George and Elvis went inside and got to be really late. They had fun out at the pool. Elvis had this pool put inside, and they did some other things, and then they got to be really late. And George said, hey, Elvis, I got to get on home, so I can get packed and everything so we can get traveling. And Elvis says, George, it's way too late. I'm too tired to drive you home. You're just going to have to stay the night. And George says, that's great, but where do I sleep? Because there's no beds left in this house. There's only, it's a small house. And all the rooms were filled up. And Elvis said, well, you'll just have to sleep in this bed here with me. In Elvis's room. And George thought about it for a minute. And later he was able to tell the story that the only man that he ever slept with in his life was Elvis Presley. And that's how George and Elvis started hanging out together as really good friends. I believe that Elvis had already seen something in George. He had seen a reflection of himself, and he wanted that kind of person to be with him. And so when George became available, he snatched him up. But George was a very talented guy. And he made it back out into the world because he just couldn't be contained within Elvis. But he loved Elvis, and they were always very close friends. And he did a lot of special things for Elvis. And Elvis did a lot of special things for him. They spent a lot of significant time together. Elvis had judged George to be a worthy friend, and George proved himself to be a worthy friend. And he proved it many times, including every single time that Elvis called for a test of loyalty. George never failed. George risked his job. George risked personal financial loss. George risked other things because Elvis said, hey, George, do this for me. George would do it. I mean, he didn't question it. And Elvis always made sure that he rewarded George. So at Christmas 1966, which is when our real story is, because we're talking about Circle G in early 1967 and how we got there. Elvis, well, he did a very special thing for George Klein. And so George was working at a radio station, and Jerry Schilling and Richard Davis, two other members of the Memphis Mafia who we've heard about in this series of stories, they show up there at the booth while George is broadcasting. And they tell George that Elvis needs to see him right away. And George says, well, I'm working. I can't just leave here. You've got to be right away, George. Elvis needs you. So George went and asked his boss and said, "Hey, Elvis says he needs me. I've got to go. I don't want to leave you hanging here, but it's Elvis, so I got to go." And his boss says, "You're right, George, you got to go." So he sent George off to meet Elvis. And then George says, a few minutes later, we pulled up to a Cadillac dealership that didn't have a single light on. Place looked completely closed up. "There's nobody here, man." "Well, he's got to be in there somewhere, GK," said Jerry. "He told us to meet him here." I got out of the car in the dark parking lot and approached the building with Jerry and Richard hanging a few steps behind me. I didn't know how I was going to get into the place, but they told me to try the main showroom door, and sure enough, it was unlocked. I stepped into the dark showroom and took a few tentative steps forward. All of a sudden, every light in the showroom came on, and the whole place lit up like a movie set. There was only one car sitting there in the middle of the showroom. A yellow 1967 Cadillac convertible. My first thought was, Elvis sure is going through a lot of trouble to show off his new car. And then there he was, strolling toward me from one of the back offices with a sly smile on his face. He stood by the car and he said, "Come here, GK." Took a few steps forward. "Stick out your hand," he said. I did. He dropped some keys into my hand. "Merry Christmas, GK." So Elvis gave GK, which is the nickname that he used for George Klein, which is the nickname that George used on the air quite a bit, GK, gave him a yellow 1967 Cadillac convertible, which was the new model of Cadillac. This is 1966, so those new models come out September, October, November of the year before. And Elvis got a brand new 67 Cadillac convertible, and a very visible one. Yellow is a very visible color for a car. And George says, the yellow 67 Cadillac convertible was mine. A gift from Elvis. The best Christmas present I'd ever gotten. From the best friend I'd ever had. I was absolutely stunned. And as I stared down at those shiny new keys in my outstretched hand, I could hear Elvis and Richard and Jerry laughing as they saw me struggle to come up with something to say. I actually started feeling a little weak in the knees. Finally, I looked square at the guy who'd given me this gift, the guy who meant the world to me. Elvis, as a man who gets paid to talk, I really ought to be able to make a great acceptance speech, but I don't know what to say. Elvis took another step toward me. He put his arm around my shoulders and he spoke softly. GK, what's fame and fortune worth if we can't share it with our friends? So that's the story of the yellow 1967 Cadillac convertible. And you might be saying to yourself, why is he talking about a Cadillac convertible when there's a Chevrolet convertible on the screen? Well, because this car that we see on the screen, George had a car. He wasn't walking to work. And this is the car. Elvis gave him a Cadillac and upgraded him from this Chevrolet Impala with a 283 cubic V8 engine with 195 horsepower and a 2-speed power glide automatic transmission. This car on the screen also includes optional features, which are power brakes, power steering, air conditioning with heater defroster, push-button AM/FM radio with power rear antenna, vinyl interior, comfort tilt steering wheel, driver's side 4-way power seat brushed aluminum instrument panel, all around tinted soft break glass, and rear fender skirts. So this is the car George was driving, so it wasn't a terrible car. It just wasn't a Cadillac. But it was still a pretty good car. And it was in really great shape because it was a 66, so it was really less than a year old. So Elvis, he looks at George and says, "You don't need that car now." And George is, Elvis is right. I don't need the car now. I have this Cadillac, but I'm sure George was thinking, I'm going to sell this car. And Elvis says, "I need the car. Give it to me." And so that's what George does. He hands over the keys and gives the car to Elvis. I mean, it's a pretty simple choice. He just gave you a Cadillac. It was going to be somewhat of a pain to get rid of this car, although I'm sure there was value tied up in it. But got all your value back in the Cadillac and a gift on top of it, I guess. So, and again, it's another test of loyalty. George, I just gave you a car. You're going to give me yours. And George immediately gives him the car. Says, "It's yours, Elvis. You do what you need with it." And so Elvis takes this car, which we can get a look at the side here. It's a pretty big car, very long. And you can see the inside, this beautiful Chevrolet convertible. Now it's many, many years older than it was when GK handed over the keys. And Elvis took that car, and I'm sure he had it cleaned up and polished up. Might have even been Alan Fortis, because that's kind of what Alan was doing at this time before he became the foreman of the ranch. He kept all the cars spotless and ready to go, maintained. Somebody had to logistically get him to whoever was going to fix them, and that's one of the things Alan did. So I'm sure this car probably came under Alan's care, at least for a little while. And then Elvis, well, he gave it to somebody for Christmas. And it's Gary Pepper, who you see right here sitting in the exact same car. That is GK's old car. GK just got a brand new Cadillac. Now, we saw yesterday that Elvis just got a brand new Cadillac limousine. It's from the Colonel for Christmas. Elvis had given away a lot of horses. GK didn't get a horse. He got the Cadillac. Gary here, he didn't get a horse. But he got a 1-year-old Chevrolet Impala convertible. Probably the nicest car Gary's family had ever had. And that car is going to be important to the future. Because I'm absolutely positive it's Gary's dad that's driving this most of the time. And we're going to hear about Gary's father. This car sold at auction in 2011 for $62,000. So somebody out there understood the emotional treasure that this car is, because it was GK's car, and then it was Elvis's car, and it was proof of loyalty of GK to Elvis. And he just handed over the keys and said, "Okay, it's yours." And then it enabled Gary and his family to do simple things like go to the grocery store, take Gary to the doctor, stuff like that. Hi, Louie. Thank you for joining. I appreciate you being here. You're welcome. So now let's hear from Sonny West. And Sonny says that, to accommodate all these horses that Elvis was getting at this time, January 1967, onto the property, it wasn't big enough. So Sonny says to accommodate all the horses on the 13-acre property, Elvis bought a bulldozer, and he raised the small home in back where Billy Smith and his wife once lived, and he paid a tidy sum to have the barn renovated. So there was a little house that used to be behind Graceland, and I don't know how many people know it was back there. And one day, Elvis decided during this January period, they needed extra room. And so he had the house knocked down. And not only did Billy Smith and his wife once live there, so did Travis Smith, Billy's father, and his wife and their family when Travis first started working as a gate guard. And Gary Pepper is going to tell us more about this. He says, in the beginning, Elvis, his dad, and the boys who worked for him were riding the horses in a side lot on the Graceland grounds and down near the front fence. But that didn't last long. It caused a traffic jam in the street in front of the house. And besides, fans were all over the front of Graceland trying to get over the tall stone wall, and he was afraid someone might get hurt. So they began riding at the back of the house. Gary's telling us that Elvis tried to share his love of the horses and his passion for riding them with the fans so that he could be out, they could see him out there in the front yard, in that side yard, but caused a distraction. People started to get risky. People could get hurt. And Elvis certainly didn't want that. Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. Gary goes on and he says, Elvis had a 7-room house in the back of the grounds, which was being used for storage purposes. So in order to have room for them to ride, he decided to demolish this house. He had a storage company come to pick up all the things stored in it and put them in storage. Would you believe Elvis himself tore it down with a huge bulldozer? He plowed right through the center of the house. And yes, you'd better believe it, the walls came tumbling down. He worked at it all day long until he had pulled it down to the ground completely. He and his dad had a ball. So not only did Elvis get a big bulldozer, he started with a small one, but it wasn't big enough to get through. So he had to call out the company again and get a much bigger bulldozer brought in. And then he and Red kind of drove these bulldozers at each other, playing a kind of a bumper cars as they knocked this house down to the ground, down flat. I believe they burn it after that. And Gary says this left him with more open space on which to ride. But as someone said, it also caused him double trouble, as the neighbors at the back of his property began yelling, "Hey Elvis, come over here." And he'd say, okay. This got out of hand because fans began coming over the fence until Elvis gave up and took refuge down in Mississippi. So not only had Graceland become too small, it was too visible, too public. It wasn't private. And then while riding at Graceland one day, Red accidentally ran Elvis down and dislocated cartilage in his chest. And Red believes that's what spurred Elvis to find a bigger place. So Sonny says place is too small. Gary says it's too public. Red says, well, I knocked him down with a horse because we don't have much room. So I'm sure all three of those played a role. Gary Pepper says Elvis purchased a 160-acre cattle ranch with a small home located about 15 minutes drive from Graceland, just at the Tennessee-Mississippi state borderline. I almost forgot to mention the beautiful lake on the property. So Gary is aware of the purchase, and we're going to see that Gary's actually been there. All right, we're going to have a really good indication Gary's been there. Now we're going to hear from Albert Goldman. And Albert, well, he's a guy that didn't like Elvis. And in the early 80s, he wrote a book called Elvis. Lamar Fike was his main source of material, but because it was a very academic book, meaning it was connected to universities and such, in this case, Columbia University, he had some funding, and he had Lamar, and Lamar was able to talk a lot of people into giving an interview. And those interviews all still exist, and they're digitized, and they're on the internet, but none of us can reach them. Unless you happen to be a student at Columbia University, or you know somebody on the faculty at Columbia University. So if any of you do, I hope that you will help them find me, and that maybe we can find some of the original interviews that were done for the project. Because until then, we've only got Albert Goldman's statements, and Albert hated Elvis. So everything is through a very strange lens, but a lot of it is based on very true stuff that came directly from people who knew Elvis. And Albert says that Elvis knew Jack Adams, who is the guy who sold the Circle G. The man who owned the Circle G, his name was Jack Adams. And Elvis said Elvis knew Jack Adams, an airplane salesman, says Albert Goldman. Back in the 50s, Adams had tried to sell Elvis a plane for his tours. And nothing had come of that effort because Gladys had told Adams that she was very alarmed at the thought of Elvis flying. Since that time, the men have never met again. So Albert's throwing this new piece of info in there that Elvis already knew who this Jack guy was. Now, we started out with Alan saying that they were just driving by the property and Elvis loved it and he saw the for sale sign and that Priscilla had mentioned it to him earlier. But Elvis had said, even then, I already knew about the property. Drive by it all the time. Marty said, oh, that piece of property that we drive by all the time. So he's indicating Elvis was already aware of it. And now Albert's telling us that somebody that he talked to let him know that Elvis already knew Jack Adams. And so the stories about the negotiations become even more suspect as to the truth, the factual truth of those memories. The emotional truth still very, very real, but the factual truth becomes more and more suspect. Now, Jerry Hopkins is a guy who worked for the Rolling Stone magazine in the 60s, the late 60s, and he wrote the Jim Morrison biography, Nobody Gets Out of Here Alive. It's a great book. He also wrote one about Elvis, but it was back in 1971. He updated it years later to include the final years, but the early one, the 71, it's a pure view of how a super fan would have seen Elvis, the knowledge that they would have had. So everything that he says is like what the fans thought at the time that Elvis was actually on the ranch. And he says the land formerly had been used for growing cotton. In recent years, it had been a pasture as a cattle ranch. And once Elvis took over, hiring a local cowhand to look after it, he bought some horses, cattle, tractors, trailers, and trucks. So the fans were aware, that he was doing these things. They just weren't aware of all the details. Now, Carol Ann Marling, she wrote a book about Elvis. And middling book, but she says vaguely, he seems to have believed that being out in the country air, getting back to basics, everybody with a horse and a pickup would make for a better world. And I think what that shows us is what everybody kind of thought Elvis was doing. It's not really the truth. It's just what people perceived. It's what they thought. We've seen there's a lot more reasons, a lot deeper reasons. Those earlier episodes that we've done, we've seen the contract that came out on January 2nd, where he was now going to only receive the colonel was going to begin to receive 50% of some of the future proceeds. It wasn't the same deal they'd always had. The colonel had renegotiated better for himself, it looked like. Although he was selling Elvis on the fact that there was going to be more money all around, so it was going to be better for everybody. His beloved Uncle Pat died. Alan's father, Alan Fortas's father, had died just recently. There were other things going on. Delta was now moving into the house. She was in her own state of grief, living with Minnie Mae in her bedroom. So, of course, that had to be affecting his grandmother, and he loved his grandmother very much. And so he bought this ranch in some ways to reassert control, and to have a place where when he said that something was going to be a certain way, it really was that certain way. He didn't have anybody fighting against him. But that's not exactly what happened on the ranch. But when he went to buy it, Albert Goldman says Jack Adams was startled when he looked out his window and he saw the big cars disgorge their loads of heavy-set men wearing Western clothes. The first men to confront Adams were Marty Lacker and Alan Fortas. They demanded to know whether his farm was for sale. Learning that it could be purchased for $530,000, they said that it was vastly overpriced. Just as the haggling began, Elvis walked into the room, having paused in the foyer to provide himself with a Coke from the machine. He asked if they could inspect the property. Adams immediately arranged for a guided tour. So Albert, who believes that he knows what he's talking about, says that Marty and Alan Fortas were there. Now, we've heard Marty say that he was there, but we heard Alan's version, and Alan didn't mention Marty. Does that mean Marty wasn't there? I don't know. And then they say that Elvis came in after getting a Coke. Well, that's not the way the others tell their story. So not sure where he got that part from. And then Albert says that it could be purchased for $530,000. Well, we saw Sonny once say that it was like $500,000. So he'd also gotten the number wrong. Number's $437,000. We know this because we saw the $5,000 down payment check in an earlier episode. It had paperwork with it. We could not see the paperwork ourselves, but it was reported to us that the paperwork with that check says 437, and it's in a whole lot of other sources. So back before that came out, everybody was guessing as to how much it was. And Albert put this $530,000 number out. Well, Sonny helped with this book. And this is where Sonny gets the $500,000 from. Now, we've also seen things like 300,000, 250,000. We've seen all kinds of numbers reported because nobody actually knew. And that's how you know who was in on the knowledge and who wasn't. Because this detail is wrong in so many of the accounts. So again, the emotional truth around the account, probably true. But the factual count, the details, a lot of those are not correct. And Nancy's asking, did Gary live at the ranch or did he go back and forth to Graceland? Gary did not live at the ranch. He would have gone back and forth. And we're going to see probably how he got back and forth here. Just a few minutes, hopefully. Gary says, it's a beautiful ranch on gently rolling pasture land, formerly in cotton, but the owner had recently made it into pasture as a cattle ranch. So those words were in a fan magazine around the time, just a couple of months after Elvis actually bought this property. So it's brand new information at the time. And it's obviously the information that Jerry Hopkins saw, because that's the same thing he said. Gary goes on, it has excellent barns, suitable for a horse ranch. The land is surrounded by a high chain cyclone link fence, which is just what Elvis needs. Elvis said he had driven past this place many times and had always wanted it. So Elvis told Gary that he'd already known. He knew about the place. It was his. He'd always wanted it. And I think that also tells us that this stress that he was under, the things that were going on around this time, the bad things, yeah, that was the trigger. Because he'd always wanted it. But somehow he got triggered into it right then. And part of it was the horses. Really got into riding the horses, which is something I don't think he thought he would do. And then he felt like, oh, hey, I've also always wanted this property, and now these two things go together. And he had large visions for the property. And we've seen that with the purchase of the trailers that he did. And the way that he put them all together to try to have a little village for himself. But we're going to get to that again here. Albert Goldman says the visit wound up at the little house at the corner of the property. There, Elvis and Vernon went into the sitting room alone to discuss the deal for 15 minutes. When they were finished, Vernon asked Adams if Elvis could spend the night in the house. Adams pulled the key off his ring and told his prospective customer, "Delighted to have you." So we know that Elvis spent that first night there. And we know Alan said after that first night, Elvis jumped up and said, "This is the best sleep I've ever had." And Albert's indicating that Vernon was there when Jack actually made that offer. And we have not seen Vernon placed there before. So again, we've seen the accounts of the people that I know of that Albert talked to. So I'm not sure where Albert got this detail. Gary says, Elvis said, "I wanted a place like this for a long time." And Albert says a couple of days later, Elvis and Vernon turned up at Adam's office again. They told him that they liked the place and wanted to buy it just as it stood, with the cattle, the equipment, the furnishings in the house, everything on the property, right down to the last roll of toilet paper. When Elvis bought the ranch, it was stacked with 150 head of prize cattle. Now, we know it was 18 head of cattle, because that's what both Marty and Alan agreed to. And they're the ones that either took care, they did paperwork taking care of these animals. So they know how many animals were there. Again, I don't know where Albert gets 150. I don't know where Albert gets that Elvis and Vernon together showed up, because the stories we heard were either that Alan went and then Elvis burst in, or Alan and Marty went and they were called and they came back to Graceland. So we just don't know the truth of this story, other than that there was a negotiation that didn't actually have any effect because Elvis paid full price. And then Sonny says, what really clinched the deal for Elvis was the huge concrete cross that sat out in the pasture by itself. Elvis saw it as a message from God that the land was blessed. It was actually a landmark for a nearby airport, but no one wanted to tell Elvis. So Sonny agrees, even though he wasn't there, that the important part of the story is the huge concrete cross. And we've seen that. It's shown up in every single account, except for Albert's. Now, Albert was a person who was very anti-religious, so that kind of makes sense to me. But the cross is very, very important in the accounts of the people who were there, and then those who heard that story directly from those people and were part of this group. Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate seeing you here. Now, Red West, he believed Elvis paid more than $500,000 for the property. So maybe that's where Albert Goldman got the idea. And then Sonny West said Elvis paid a reported $437,000 for the spread. Now, Sonny said this after that check and documentation came out. So by that point, he knew. And he was able to give the correct information. Now, George, he was there that first night. The first night that Elvis spent on the Circle G, he was there. And he said, after work, I picked up Barbara. Barbara is his girlfriend, Barbara Little, who we know from an earlier story works for for Dr. Nicopolis. After work, I picked up Barbara, and we headed down to Elvis's new property. The little ranch house was packed with Memphis Mafia members, spouses, and girlfriends. I guess I'd initially been a little grumpy about having to make the drive down to this unfamiliar spot, but my mood changed as soon as I stepped into that party. Everyone seemed to be in an exceptionally good mood, and Elvis was beaming with a glow I hadn't seen for some time. GK, you made it, he shouted when he saw me. Elvis, I can't believe this. You bought yourself a ranch? Bought it in a day, GK. We'll have some good times here. So George is telling us that although Elvis hasn't actually bought the property yet, George isn't aware of that. According to him, Elvis is saying, I bought the property. So Elvis has made that decision before the first night's even over. They're having a great time there. There's a party going on. He's buying this place. He is buying this place. And then George says, when the idea of naming the place was raised, a lot of suggestions got tossed around. Alan Fortas came up with Circle G, and Elvis started to object, thinking the G was for Graceland. And then Alan explained he was thinking of G for Elvis's mother Gladys, and the name took. So no one else has really told us what the G stood for, and it's kind of strange because you think Alan might have, because he's central to George's story here, but George is saying it's for Gladys. And if George really had a dog in this race, you would think he'd say it was G for George. The Circle G for George, but he confesses that it's for Gladys. And that's where we're going to end the stories for today. We've just now got back onto the ranch. He just bought it again. So that's where we're going to actually be picking up next time. We're going to see more and more about what's happening on this ranch. And so I'm going to leave you guys for today with another song that I wrote. And it's called He Gave Away His Heart. And until I see you guys again, you all keep on taking care of business.
Midnight lights, rhinestone fire, Arabian suit, burning with desire. He hit the stage like thunder rolls. Vegas shook and the story unfolds. Charlie's birthday, crowd went wild. He cracked a joke and sang with style. But just before he sang Hurt So Deep, he stopped the show and made us weep. He gave away his heart, not just a song, diamonds and gold, where the love belongs. Rings and shades from the man backstage. He healed the broken, he lit the flame. Oh, he gave away his heart, and I saw it all that night. Black in hair, the man stepped near. Elvis smiled, the crowd could hear. Thanks to you, we raised the light. 17,000 hearts took flight, then back behind the velvet door. He gave away a little more. Music ring, a boxcar shine, a suit that held his sacred time. He gave away his heart, not just a song, diamonds and gold, where the love belongs. Rings and shades from the man backstage. He healed the broken, he lit the flame. Oh, he gave away his heart, and I saw it all that night. He didn't need applause to know his worth. He gave away his soul in Vegas mirth. Not just a king, but something more. A man who knew what hearts were for. Gave away his heart, not just a soul. Pieces of love where the brave belong. Ritual gifts from the man backstage. He saved the hurting, he the flame. Oh, he gave away his heart, and I'll never be the same. I was there, I saw the rings, I saw the light. Gave away his heart, and it burned so bright. 17, snow on the ground, Circle G, love all around. He bought that ranch, opened the gate, said come on in, let's celebrate. Tractor pulling through the snow, laughter rising, spirits glow. Both behind, wives and men, family fun again and again. He wasn't just a star in lights, he was the warmth in winter nights. kindness wrapped in velvet flame, a heart that never played the fame. He gave us joy, he gave us grace, a piano song in a quiet place, from a jack to a king. In the moonlight ring, he gave us love, he gave us wings. Circle G, where the angels sing. He gave us everything. Riding horses, lakes so still, bridge and cross on the quiet hill. Barbecue smoke, stories told, moments more precious than gold. He'd ask me who I'm dating now, what I dream, what I'd allow. He cared like kin, not just a name. He lived for love, not for acclaim. He wasn't just a voice on stage, he was the soul behind the page. A man who'd sing to heal your day and laugh the midnight blues away. He gave us joy, he gave us grace, a piano song in a quiet place, from a jack to a king. In the moonlight rain, he gave us love, he gave us wings. Circle G, where the angels sing. He gave us everything. A shadow in the night, famous face, but heart so bright. Couldn't walk the street like you and me, so we built a world where we were free. He gave us joy, he gave us grace, a piano song in a quiet place, from a jack to a king. In the moonlight ring, he gave us love, he gave us wings. Gave us everything. Oh, yes, he gave us everything.